Last month, we launched a new series called Binational Dialogues, a forum on U.S.-Mexico public policy. Our first discussion in the series covered the state of Mexico's economy and what's ahead for it. There are obviously a lot of questions about Donald Trump's tariff regime and what's happening in North American trade. There are questions about the future of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, and about what exactly is happening in Washington and Mexico City. So first, what's the state of Mexico's economy today? What policy shifts and developments should we be looking at for the future? José Antonio Meade Kuribreña is the perfect person to answer those questions. He's a distinguished Mexican politician, economist, lawyer, diplomat, and former presidential candidate. Between 2011 and 2017, he held several high-level cabinet positions, including Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Secretary of Social Development, Secretary of Energy, and twice Secretary of Finance and Public Credit in Mexico. I'm Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. And this is Mexico Centered. This is a conversation on the state of Mexico's economy. Obviously, there's a lot of questions about the tariffs. There's a lot of questions about what's going on in North America. There's a lot of questions about the future of the USMCA. And there's a lot of questions about what's going on in Washington and Mexico City. And I think there's hardly anyone else that can give us a few insights into what we can expect today and in the future. So let me welcome Dr. José Antonio Meade.
Thank you, Tony. Happy to be here. It took some time for me to get back. So I had to put a lot of my curriculum to be invited back to the center. So I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you. And we're looking forward to cooperating with you a lot more in the future. So let me begin with the obvious question, the question I just asked. What is the current state of Mexico's economy? Just this morning, I was reading in the media that Mexico is effectively in a recession. Where is Mexico's economy right now? What are the major variables affecting Mexico's economic performance today?
Let me give you a slightly longer answer because I think it's relevant to put it in context. Mexico has faced brutal uncertainty in 5 occasions in the last 20 or so years. 2 of those times, the uncertainty came through Mexico, and we found certainty to working outside of Mexico. That was the case in 82 and 94. There was a lot of uncertainty generated in Mexico, and we found ways to leverage on the external markets and external support to get confidence back. Then there were a couple of instances where the uncertainty came from abroad. 2009 and 2010 after the financial crisis, and then the first time President Trump was elected. In those cases, the uncertainty came from abroad, and we did a lot of work in Mexico to bring certainty back. That included fiscal reforms and some other things, and we can get a little bit deeper into that. This is the 5th occasion where we faced uncertainty. This time it's different, though, because the uncertainty comes from the outside, the uncertainty that we're getting around trade policy of President Trump, but there's also uncertainty that comes from within. Some of the major reforms, most notably the judicial reform, have introduced a big source of uncertainty. Now, I went a long way to say that given the size of the shock, the Mexican economy has actually shown a lot of resilience. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, or even in the mid-10s, something of this magnitude would have derailed the Mexican economy to the point where we would not be debating if we had a recession or not. So my impression is that the recession is a very politically charged word. I think that Mexico is either a little bit above zero or a little bit below zero. What's striking is we had not seen, we had not envisioned, we had not planned for the size of the uncertainty that we are facing. And given the size of that uncertainty, I would say that the Mexican economy has shown an interesting element of resilience. To answer your question, we're going to be close to zero, either a little bit from above or a little bit from below. So the Mexican economy has, without that, weakened. But if you correct being close to zero with the magnitude of both the external and the internal shocks and compare them to the last 4 instances where we had such uncertainty, I think that there's an amount of resiliency within the Mexican economy that needs to be explored and probably valued.
So let me pick that particular point about the uncertainty that comes from the tariffs. So far, there's been a lot of uncertainty, and there's tariffs. There aren't any lower tariffs. We have a big debate in the United States about tariffs as well. Where do you expect tariffs to finally settle? And what do you expect to be the effect on Mexico and Mexico's manufacturing? Just this morning, I was reading some articles about the fact that companies are beginning to think, okay, we can produce in Mexico perhaps for international markets, but then we have to bring some of that production into the United States and sort of protect the access to the American market by shifting the production chains a little bit. So what do you see? Where is this issue of the tariffs going to end up finally?
I must confess I'm surprised about the magnitude of the tariffs. When President Trump campaigned on the basis of tariffs, he campaigned on the basis of wanting to use them for several different purposes. He wanted to use them for leverage vis-a-vis Mexico on migration and fentanyl, together with Canada. He wanted to use tariffs to bring manufacturing back to the US. He wanted to use tariffs to get income. But I think that nobody within the profession would have envisioned the size of the tariffs that we are today debating. I don't think that's an equilibrium. I don't think it's really useful to think about the tariff debate as something between Mexico and the US, or even as something between the US and the rest of the world. We will find probably better answers if we start looking at what the tariffs are likely to do or not with the value chains. And the value chains are clearly mostly North American in nature. So I think that when one tries to envision what the equilibrium would look like, it's useful to think about it under the scope of value chains rather than under the scope of just Mexico-US. Because at the end, this is a negotiation of how the US wants to look like in the future. And I think that negotiation, Mexico is going to be a party to that. We're going to be a big, important partner to that process. But really, it's a stress that will force the US to rethink itself. And I'm often reminded, we read The Little Prince, there's this conversation between the little prince and a king, and the king sort of reflects if he asks one of his generals to turn into a seagull and the general disobeys, the philosophical question whether it's the fault of the general that's not obeying or the king that's asking the general for something that's unreasonable. I think in the process of rethinking the US, you're going to find some natural limits, and you're going to find that you can't go at it alone, and that you cannot de-emphasize the presence of Mexico and of China and of Europe at the same time. And I think that will impose some rationality to the end state of the debate. I think if you look at the US demographics, if you look at the way that the American economy is structured around services, the way that the American economy is structured around consumption, that puts natural limits to the type of reindustrialization that we're likely to see going forward. I think that gives us some lights in terms of what the end result will be. And I have a hard time envisioning a result where the US de-anchors itself from the world, if for no other reason, because the harm that would be caused in the individual value chains, and therefore in the American companies involved in those value chains, would make it unreasonable. So I think that we need to transcend what's going to happen in the next couple of months and really think about what a reasonable equilibrium looks like. And my impression is that when one looks at the fundamentals, the likelihood that we come out of it with value chains that are competitive are going to be essential for the US and for North America going forward.
I have a question about Mexico's economic performance that I've been thinking about a little bit. Where is Mexico's economic performance given a couple of things? Number one is a budget deficit that is rather large. President Sheinbaum is trying to bring it down to 4%. That's still quite a bit, but it went up to 6% or so under the López Obrador administration. And then we got the remittances, which are also equivalent to a subsidy of 3.7% or so of the Mexican economy. So in some ways, I wonder about the structural issues with the Mexican economy. Is it really as resilient and as strong if you consider that the budget deficit is subsidizing a lot of the consumption via cash transfer programs and expenditures that are really on borrowed money, and then the remittances? So tell us a little bit about the solidity, structural solidity of the Mexican economy. And I want to add one more element that I think you're ideally equipped to speak to, and that has to do with productivity. Mexico is a two-speed economy, right? There is the formal economy, the for export economy, and then there is the other half of the economy that is incredibly unproductive. So tell us a little bit about that structural issues that the Mexican economy is facing.
I think it's useful to look at the last 6 years, the López Obrador administration. And then you get some headline numbers that I think anchor your question. No, the Mexican economy did relatively poorly in the last administration. It was the second worst economic performance of the last 100 years. So that gives you an element in terms of the economy as a whole was not performing. But then as you double click on those numbers, you find some surprising stories. The one that surprises me the most, and that kind of anchors what I think is going to happen at the end in terms of trade, is how well the export sector of Mexico performed. During the first 4 years of the López Obrador administration, Mexico's exports grew 9% per year. We were already a big exporter in 2018, and there wasn't an explicit policy to build around the export sector. One could even argue to the contrary. The energy policy specifically was not very conducive to Mexico exporting as much as it had, and that explains one of the strengths that we have today. But 9% per year on average means that Mexico's export platform actually grew by close to 50% in just under an that in terms of their two velocities. But that shows a Mexico that did very well on their complicated set of scenarios. It wasn't obvious that Mexico was going to be able to sync up its opening with the US because the COVID waves were not synchronized. Yet Mexico did. And I think the US found out that having a presence in Mexico was relevant in the presence of disruptions that happened in the rest of the world. If you have piracy in Yemen, and therefore you're not able to access routes on the Mediterranean, and then bringing things from Asia to the Americas is expensive, having a presence in Mexico helps. If there's a drought in Central America and the Panama Canal is not working as efficiently as it does, having a presence in Mexico actually helps. So it turns out that what the last 6 years, I think, showed us is that having Mexico being part of the value chain actually increases the resilience of North America. And that Mexico was resilient to shocks that had to do with health, to shocks that had to do with policy, and to shocks that had to do with everything from the climate to piracy. So I think that as one thinks about North America going forward, it's kind of hard to envision with Mexico not being part of the solution, and it's hard to conclude that we're far away from being the problem, rather that we're closer, I think, to being part of the solution. If you look at our public finances, 50%, 51% debt to GDP is not a big number. And it's not a big number in relative terms, even though we're worse off than we were in 2018, even though I think it was obvious that the budget, the expenditure did not fit comfortably on the income that we're generating. The first 5 years of the López Obrador administration, I think, produced reasonably sustainable public finances. Now, the last year of the López Obrador administration put strain on the budget, and they generated a deficit that's clearly unsustainable. I think that what's valuable about this year's budget is that they sent a signal with cost that they were going to move in the right direction. I don't think you're going to get to 3.9. I think that's a stretch, coming down from 6. But I think that if there's movement in the right direction and with a significant magnitude, I think that the markets will become conceived that the Sheinbaum administration is willing to put political capital into a convergence, a consolidation of our finances in a way that brings us back to sustainability. So I think that you're right. I think that the last year of the administration projected forward would not be sustainable. I think that the Sheinbaum administration is cognizant of that, and with cost, because typically when you start an administration, you ask for some leniency from the market in terms of running a deficit in your first year and then promising to correct and to consolidate going forward. They didn't do that. They started the consolidation process, or they signaled that they will start the consolidation process within the first year. I think in terms of something that the market should be attentive of, the market, I think, should look at whether or not we're moving in the right direction. And again, in a magnitude that's significant. I don't think we need to get to 3.9, but we need to have a number that's clearly lower than 6 in a way that's significant, and that sends the signal that even under all of this uncertainty, the administration is cognizant of the fact that they need to consolidate their public finances.
Let me ask you a question about the peso, because...
Sorry, just remittances, because I think that's very interesting. Remittances went from about 30 billion to about 60 billion in the administration. That's a huge quantum of increase. And it's especially big because there's not twice as many Mexicans in the US as there were at the beginning of the administration. So that begs the question as to what's happening behind the remittances. My impression is that there are some benign and strong tendencies behind them. One of them that I think was actually sort of embedded more because of the pandemic, the emergence of platforms in a very significant way. So suddenly you can drive an Uber. Suddenly you can work and be a repartidor of food from the supermarkets. So the platforms are a way of including many of the people that were excluded or condemned to be in that lower productivity sector that you envision. So that, I think, was a big part of it. In general, I think after the pandemic, there was a reappreciation of unqualified workers' wage. And I think that tended to favor Mexicans. I think there's been a huge revolution in how remittances are actually produced. 15 years ago, if you wanted to remit money to Mexico, you would have to get in a plane at 12 o'clock at night in New York and bring the money back to Puebla in cash. Today, the platforms have really made that technology available at a much lower cost. So you see remittances going up almost everywhere. So if you take into account technological change, the revalorization of unqualified labor, and just the transformation of inclusiveness, finance, and financial platforms, I think that gives a relatively benign and relatively structural support of the remittances that we've had. I would not be surprised if they fall, but I don't think that they're at risk of falling to the levels that we saw in 2018. I rather think that was a sustainable shift that we would likely continue to see going forward.
So let me go back to the question I was going to ask about the peso. I know that politically, a devaluation is controversial in Mexico. I think that there's some trauma, historical trauma around devaluations in Mexico. Where is the peso now? Where is Mexico's monetary policy right now? Are we on the right spot? Are we overvalued, undervalued? The dollar is also moving. Can you elucidate a little bit of the monetary policy right now?
Yeah. So when I contrasted, the different instances of uncertainty and the impact that uncertainty had on Mexico, I think the big shift, what was a game changer, is Mexico moving to a flexible exchange rate. Economists in Mexico used to say that there was two ways to paint a house. You could have the brush stand fixed and move the house, or you could let the house be fixed and move the brush. Clearly, it's better to move the brush than to move the house. And I think that one of the things that has worked really, really well in Mexico for the last 25 years is the flexible exchange rate. So if you go back to the 90s and you go back to the 80s, the trauma of moving the exchange rate was there. If you look at what the exchange rate has done in the last year, before the Sheinbaum election, before President Sheinbaum was elected, the peso was around 16 to the dollar. Now it's around 20. That's a 20% devaluation in 4 or 5 months. From a policy perspective, that's probably the one thing that has helped anchor the Mexican economy the best. So the direction that you would have wanted the peso to move is exactly the direction that it has moved. You wanted to be able to deal with the uncertainty, with the peso moving in the direction that it did. And I think it's useful to think about where the peso is in the following terms. If the peso today were at 16, people would be leaving. So at 16, it would be cheap to exit the market and move elsewhere. If you were having doubts as to whether you would invest in Mexico at 16, you would be hard-pressed to come into Mexico. When the peso moves from 16 to 20, suddenly leaving Mexico at 20 becomes a more expensive proposition. And entering Mexico at 20 becomes a little bit more reasonable. So I think that the exchange rate is working exactly the way that it should. But I think that looking at the exchange rate in Mexico actually allows us to go to a very interesting policy debate. In Mexico, you had the central bank wanting to combat inflation, and you had an administration that was very aggressive in its labor policies. So I think that disconnect between generating cost pressure on the part of your labor policies and wanting to control the inflation with the interest rate actually generated an uncomfortable position to Mexico, because you had a very, very high interest rate, similar to the one that Brazil had, and Brazil owes twice as much as Mexico does, similar to the one that Russia had, and Russia is a country that's at war, and clearly distinct to where the interest rate should be for a country that has a 50% debt to GDP ratio. So I think that the policies that you were putting into place in labor actually resulted in an uncomfortably high interest rate that made it difficult to grow. And the fact that the central bank now has found ways to reduce the interest rate probably signals a better level of coordination between the labor policy and the monetary policy. I still think there's ways to go. I still think that more coordination is warranted. But at the very least, there would be the impression that there's a better realization that the labor policy is not free, and that you pay for that labor policy with the interest rate and with lower growth. And to talk about it in a more cohesive framework and in better coordination between the central bank and the authority, I think is going to be positive. And my impression is that having had the now Minister of Finance, having worked in the central bank, I think that that will help to bring that level of coordination to a much better place. And I think that gives space for Mexico towards a monetary stance that is a little bit more conducive to growth than what we had in the last 5 or 6 years.
Let me ask you about investment. We've been talking about nearshoring in Mexico, investment in Mexico. There's a debate over whether investment was actually something that materialized or not in the case of Mexico. There were opportunities after the pandemic for reshoring, nearshoring, and such. And I got a running dialogue with a colleague at the Tec de Monterrey over whether nearshoring was a fact or not. He says yes, because there was a lot of reinvestment. I say no, because a greenfield investment, which is the total new investment, is too low. But Mexico needs to grow faster, and it can't grow faster without investment. And I mean not just private investment, but also public investment. Can you unpack for us the issue of investment in Mexico and whether public and private, and whether it's enough to get the Mexican economy in the future, maybe not this year, but in the future, to grow at the pace at which more people in Mexico can be lifted from poverty into the middle class?
A couple of things. I think that's a fantastic question. I tend to think that you're right, and you should be winning your bets with your tech colleague. But I think that we've gotten the nearshoring narrative wrong. I think that Mexico is not going to grow because of nearshoring. I think because Mexico grew, there's an argument for Mexico to continue being a structural part of the global economy. So we were not even talking about nearshoring, and the Mexican export sector was growing without meaningful greenfield investments. And again, 9% per year. So I think that it is that growth rate under stress that sort of signals to the world that Mexico is significant, that we're structural, and that we're an important part of the global economy. Now, I don't think that we're going to be talking about nearshoring. I think that we need to nuance our thinking about nearshoring, and that brings me back to the first question. I think that what we're going to be talking about is North American value chains. How do we bring them back into the US and into Mexico? I don't think, again, that it makes a lot of sense thinking about the US and Mexico as separate entities in terms of value chains. I think there's an intention of the Trump administration to bring back manufacturing into the US. And I think that they can do that. They can shift some value chains back into the US. They just can't go at it alone. They're going to need Mexico, they're going to need Canada, and they're going to need China at certain points. You cannot de-emphasize the Chinese presence in the North American value chains. Part of what China brings into those value chains are integral in explaining their competitiveness. So I think that once you're set into what value chains you want to bring back into North America, then you solve back that equation and see what part of that value chain needs to be anchored in Mexico, what part of that value chain can be anchored in Canada, and what part of that value chain needs to be anchored in China. And I think that there will be a rebalancing of the presence of North American value chains. And I think that there will be more investment in Mexico as a result of that. But it makes more sense, I think, analytically, to think about bringing back some manufacturing presence within the North American economy, Mexico being an integral part of that conversation. So I don't think that you bring manufacturing in Mexico as a standalone process. I think that what you've seen with Mexico and the US is that almost nothing we do is standalone. I don't think that's going to change. The mix might move a little bit, but I think that after this couple of months and the noise surrounding the tariffs and the rethinking that we have to do about North America, you still have, I think at the end, North American value chains rather than just US or Mexico production.
Let me continue on the question of China. Everything I hear in the United States today is that China is a rival and that China has to be contained and confronted. Very few voices actually argue for cooperation with the Chinese. There's talk about delinking, decoupling the American economy from China's. But Mexico, again, it's an important component of all this, even though I don't often hear the words China and Mexico put together in debates in the United States when it comes to China, because the United States thinks more strategically and geostrategically, and Mexico is only a part of that. But Mexico's economy is now actively engaged with the Chinese. What do you think has to be Mexico's position when the time to renegotiate the agreement comes, the USMCA, and China's access to Mexico? Because I'm afraid that in the United States, the conversation is going to be China has to stay out of Mexico, or Mexico must limit Chinese investment in Mexico, Chinese incursion in Mexico. How can Mexico accommodate both the need to integrate with the United States and Chinese presence in Mexico to the extent that it will satisfy American geostrategic interests and idea that the Chinese presence in Mexico is not a desirable thing for the United States?
I think that's a fantastic question. And I think that benefits also from going a little bit back in history and recognizing that the US is saying now is very similar to what Mexico was saying in 2000. Mexico was literally the last country to vote in favor of China acceding to the World Trade Organization. This is not figurative. This is literally the last country that actually voted for accession. And if you remember, in order to get the vote for accession, you had to negotiate bilaterally with every single country. And what Mexico was saying in the beginning of the 2000s is that's going to be disruptive for Mexico, so we need high tariffs. And we negotiated with China high tariffs to protect Mexico in the process which China would be participating in the global economy. So the argument of using tariffs to protect versus China participating in the global economy was first argued by Mexico in the 2000s. Now, that argument didn't get very far. At the time, the US wanted China to be part of the World Trade Organization. Mexico ended up voting for that accession. But I think that set up an agenda that was very interesting for Mexico and that bears light in terms of the question today. So we learned to compete, to grow, and to cooperate with the Chinese. Mexico's exports to the US are not Chinese intensive, and they're not becoming Chinese intensive. The exports to the US are to the tune of about, 80 billion, and the imports from China are to the tune of probably 100 billion, a little bit less than that. And the delta of what Mexico is now exporting to the US and the delta of what we're buying from China sort of shows that we're not becoming more intensive in Chinese inputs as we grew our presence in the US. But having said all of that, some of the Chinese components are critical for both the US and Mexico. So it brings us back to the general and whether he turns into a seagull or not. It's going to be impossible, I think, for the US to decouple away from Mexico and continue to be competitive. I think it's going to be possible at the margins to reduce Asian presence in Mexico and the US and to develop some value chains in North America that are currently concentrated on Asia. But I don't think it's feasible or reasonable to de-emphasize the global presence that China now has. Even though the debate now seems centered on absolutes, I think as we move forward and we start sort of understanding better how the value chains work today, because we're eventually going to reach physical limits, almost existential limits. There are some things that are not produced outside of China. And that I think is going to bring back to certain elements of post-information, of reality to the debate that will eventually bring us to something that's going to be different from what we had before, but that's not going to convert North America into an island. I think that at the end of this process, I'm guardedly optimistic about it, you're going to have more North America because all of this effort, I think, is geared towards having more presence of value chains in North America, but you're going to end up having more Mexican presence in the North American economic sphere.
There are a couple of things, perhaps, that I'm not an economist, but you are, that I think guarantee or put a country on a solid path to growth. And that is investment in infrastructure, in human capital, and in science and technology. Is Mexico investing enough in infrastructure, human capital, and science and technology to guarantee that it continues on that path of growth in the future, even if not now?
We're not. And I think that points to a structural concern where there's an opportunity for Mexico to do better in the following sense. We have not been able to depoliticize infrastructure in Mexico. So regardless of what's happening in the US and regardless of what's happening in Mexico, every 6 years, the country stops to see where the administration wants to invest and under what private and public participation of partnership are they going to finance that. Now, the tragedy of the last administration and the tragedy of not being able to depoliticize infrastructure is that where you had projects, basically the energy sector and the airport, there was no political will. And where there was political will, there were no projects. So I think that what Mexico needs to do is similar to what many countries like the UK do. Where do we want to be in 40 years? What infrastructure do we need to have in order to make that happen? And work our way towards that by getting into place a pipeline of infrastructure projects and deciding how do we want to finance them in terms of the private and public mix. Now, I think that there's advantages of Mexico doing that now that we didn't have 20 years ago. We can finance our infrastructure with pesos, long-term fixed rate. That was not something that was feasible some years back. But we need to depoliticize it, and we need a pipeline for infrastructure, and we don't have that. In sexenio after sexenio, we put everything on hold to try to discern where the political will be, and then to try to understand what the private and public mix in terms of financing that infrastructure will be. I think if we're able to depoliticize it and bring academia, private sector, and government into the mix, then Mexico has the financial capacity to fund in pesos long-term many of our infrastructure needs. So I don't think that it's something structural. I think that it's an agenda that can be worked around. And it's an agenda where some elements of it are political, the energy sector, but some elements of it are not. Some elements of it just mean working our way backwards from where we want to be to where we are now and deciding what infrastructure needs to be put into place. If we don't depoliticize infrastructure, we will continue to be condemned to having mediocre growth.
Final question. The USMCA, as of right now, because of the tariffs, what's the spirit of a free trade agreement if not to lower tariffs? So raising tariffs on Canada and Mexico is almost not quite killing the USMCA because, it's still the law of the land, so to speak, the international law of the land, but it's kind of a zombie agreement. It's not dead. It's not alive. Its spirit is being contradicted by practice now. But in 2026, we're supposed to renegotiate the USMCA. By October 1st, President Trump will have to inform Congress over whether he intends to renegotiate the agreement or not. I guess Mexico will also have to engage that. The Canadians, in my understanding, the Canadians are thinking that why would they want to renegotiate an agreement that can be violated at any time, and it's kind of humiliating for them to go and beg for a renegotiation when their own existence as a country is being threatened with absorption by the United States. So it's a very delicate position that all three countries are in. What do you see about the future of the USMCA? What do you predict will happen in 2026 when it's supposed to be either continued, renewed, or ended?
I think this is a very structural question, but I think that the only thing that's faring worse than the free trade agreement is the World Trade Organization. And I think this is not to be flippant, but this is really to point out something that's quite structural. If between the two, because the tariffs run afoul of USMCA, but they also run afoul of the World Trade Organization. What you're hearing from the Trump administration is if you want to come into the US, you need to do it through USMCA. In a way, even under all of the noise, even under all of the pressure, the way that the Trump administration has prioritized in terms of continuing to trade with Mexico is to do it within the context of the USMCA. And I think there's some reasons to that. If you look at Mexico-US trade, about 50% of it was done outside of the USMCA to take advantage of the relatively low, most favored nation tariffs that the US had. 50% of that trade was done through USMCA. And what the Trump administration did in terms of the tariffs, it sort of introduced more elements to the USMCA versus the World Trade Organization. So the US basically said, well, we don't want for Mexican exports to enter through World Trade Organization. If you want to be tariff-free, then you need to come into the US via the USMCA. So again, I'm sure that this rethinking will result in something different from what we have today. But at this stage, if you look at how the trade between Mexico and the US is going to be governed, it's going to be governed at the end of the year more by USMCA than it was governed by World Trade Organization. So I think if one were to rethink global trade, what I think is most at risk today is the World Trade Organization framework. And what I think is going to be, or what I think is being strengthened, at least in the short run, is USMCA. Again, guarded optimism in the fact that it's an instrument that will survive in some way, shape, or form. Because today, given the two alternatives that were both legal, coming into the US through World Trade Organization or coming through the US via USMCA, what the US administration has signaled is that they want for trade to be governed by USMCA. And I think administration has weakened more this World Trade Organization, not just vis-a-vis Mexico, but in general vis-a-vis the world. So I don't know whether it survives as it is, but I think having some governing mechanism in terms of Mexico-US trade is going to be left. That's going to continue to happen. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe it engages in some structural changes. This stress and this rethinking would probably result in something different. But the signals that have been sent is we like for trade to be governed by an agreement that we commonly reach between the three countries, rather than from you to come through multilateral agreements where the US seems to feel less confident about.
Thank you. So I really thank you, Dr. Meade, for joining us today in this conversation. Obviously, we are going through some turbulence, but I think it'll settle. And then hopefully in the future, we'll take up again the idea of a North America that works in tandem for the prosperity of all three countries. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thanks for listening. If you're interested in attending our Binational Dialogues, you can register for future webinars. Follow us on social media, on X, and LinkedIn for future dates. The Judy Leigh Allen Mexico-centered podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, which seeks to have a meaningful impact on the U.S.-Mexico relationship through binational policy research and solutions, and by convening leaders who can bridge the world of ideas and the world of action. Special thanks to Judy Leigh Allen for her generous support of the work that we do here at the Center, and to Albi Delgado for our program manager. The episode was produced by Albi Delgado with support from Karina Zimel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico to learn more. And thanks for listening.